Is that poor old hag gone yet? La.
I glare at the man with irritation filling my voice. The ex-husband who ran off with his mistress, leaving behind his blind mom. The way he speaks of her, so different from the kind son she once had, brings my anger to a boiling point.
You must have had it tough, huh? Now you're free. Go ahead, live your life. Although for an old hag like you, there must be limits.
He laughs crudely and I respond with a hidden rage, but a beaming smile.
Yeah, got a cool 3 million from the estate. So yes, I will enjoy my freedom now.
His smile fades instantly. Little does he know that soon he'll be the one begging for forgiveness and apologizing. My name is Lilia. I'm 63 now, got married young and ended up living with the in-laws. They were kind, but my husband, what a disappointment. Divorced him 10 years ago. At 53, with my daughter Karina 18 and my son Eddie 15, right at the costly college phase. Plus, my mother-in-law Betty was blind. Raising kids and caring for Betty, it wasn't easy. Met Keith at work. I was fresh out of high school at 18. He was 24 in his second year. He was a senior and seemed reliable, which made me admire him. Keith had a caring nature and took me under his wing. Popular, yet he chose me and we started dating. I first met his parents, Derek and blind Betty, after we decided to marry. Learning how Keith supported them while working moved me deeply. My parents opposed the marriage. They feared the caregiving would be too much for me. However, my husband's parents are such wonderful people, but I was young and overruled their concerns, marrying into his wonderful family. Defying my parents led to a fallout, but I had my new family. Youth is fearless. Quit my job after the wedding to care for my in-laws and let Keith focus on work. They were grateful, treating me like their own. Despite the hardship, caring for them was never a burden. I believed our home life was perfect, with Keith working hard. Then a chance meeting with a workmate at the supermarket. The conversation naturally turned to my husband and me.
He always leaves work early, saying you have it hard. Such a wonderful husband, right?
I was stunned. Keith always returned past 10 p.m., hardly early. It must be a mistake, I thought, but could only agree awkwardly. I confronted Keith that evening. Meant it to be a slight nudge.
Been coming home late, haven't you? Can't you come home a bit earlier? Derek seems guilty getting help from a woman. Maybe you could at least assist with his bath.
But before I finished, Keith lashed out.
What? I'm working, not playing. Tell Dad to stop being so selfish with his requests.
Dad said nothing. It's just how I feel.
He seems to have no intention of caregiving, and he's too defensive about it. Which makes me suspect my bad feeling is right. Back then, I couldn't admit it, too afraid of confirming a truth I didn't want to face. Having pushed against my parents' advice to marry him, I had no home to return to, and I was worried about the in-laws. In the end, I chose to continue every day as usual. One day, I thought about buying an electric wheelchair for Derek. He used a cane in a regular wheelchair, but an electric one could give us little walks. I imagined pushing Betty in it, going further on our strolls, so I suggested it to my husband. I believed he'd be on board, but his reaction was lackluster.
An electric wheelchair? Do we need it?
His face showed reluctance at my suggestion.
We're stretched thin on my income alone. Is this necessary spending?
We weren't rich, true, but if it could bring the smallest joy to my in-laws, it wasn't a waste to me.
How about we use Derek and Betty's pensions to pay it off gradually? Maybe take a small loan?
He seemed to agree, reluctantly saying, just don't make it my problem.
I couldn't relay his words to the in-laws, but I told them positively that we could get the loan, and Derek was happy. We got the loan and the wheelchair. They were thrilled with it. But soon after, Derek passed away.
Betty and I were heartbroken, but my husband complained. He left us with debt. I told you not to buy it.
Betty must have heard. I was filled with regret. With Derek gone, it was just Betty and me. She's blind, but she knows her way around the house. My caregiving burden lessened. Around that time, my husband suggested we think about having kids. I doubted him once. But if he's bringing it up, perhaps I misunderstood. And then we had our 2 children. Sadly, even after they were born, my husband didn't change. He continued to neglect our home. Amidst the daily grind of chores and parenting, Betty's happiness was my solace. She couldn't see her grandchildren, but after Derek's death, her days grew brighter with their lively voices. We lived happily. Despite my husband's constant late returns from work, just as my workmate had pointed out, and I can't forget his words at Derek's funeral, there seemed to be no love for Betty or the kids. And recently, even on weekends, he'd say off to work.
There seemed to be no love for Betty or the kids, and recently, even on weekends, he'd say off to work.
And that's when my affection faded. As long as he brought in money, that was enough for me. Despite our broken marriage, the kids grew up kind and sincere. Our family's turning point came when our daughter turned 18, ready to start college in the spring.
I'm off to work.
On a weekend with no work, yet he said that and tried to leave. I stopped him.
Weren't you supposed to take Betty to the hospital today?
We had made that promise days before. Today is Betty's health checkup day, and it's also the day my daughter, now a college student, is to take over her new apartment. I knew these schedules in advance, so I had asked my husband to take Betty to the hospital.
What? That's the housewife's job, isn't it?
He yelled at me.
Didn't I say today was the handover of Karina's house? We need to get the household goods in order and set up a living environment before school starts. So I said I'd go with you.
I snapped back at my husband, and it seemed to anger him too. I didn't remember ever talking back or rebelling like this. Being defied by me for the first time, it looked like my husband got excited too.
I didn't hear any of that. I married you thinking you wouldn't be popular with men, and I'd be stuck with Dad and Mom. But now you want me to take care of Mom? That old lady? If you really can't go, just let her go by herself.
I was stunned by his words. What a terrible person. I had vaguely realized he was treating Betty poorly, but to send blind Betty out alone seemed too cruel. And the way he insulted me was too much. I was frustrated to learn the reason my once popular husband had wanted to marry me.
Fine.
That was all I said to my husband. I had given up expecting anything from him. Satisfied with my lack of response, my husband said, "Then take good care of that old lady and the kids." And with that, my husband never returned home. In the end, I had my daughter take care of the key handover and the purchase of necessities for her new life. Meanwhile, I accompanied Betty to a health checkup. Somehow, we got through the day. Everyone realized that my husband had not returned, but no one spoke a word of it. A few days later, a letter arrived at the house from my husband. No address, just a name. It contained a simple letter and a divorce application. He was living with his mistress. He said he wanted nothing to do with the debts left by my parents and that I should live my life without him. I was tired. I thought I'd be happier cutting ties with him. That's what I thought. Before submitting the divorce papers, I told the children and Betty. Betty was the most shocked.
I'm so sorry.
Holding my hand, Betty could only repeat those words through her tears.
I've been happy enough with you, Karina, and Eddie. But if you're divorced, I'm a stranger. I'll live on my own. It'll take time, but I'll make sure to leave.
That's what Betty muttered. I responded to her a bit more firmly this time.
Betty, you are no different from my real mom. And to the children, you're the only grandmother they have. We don't need to worry about life after divorce. We are family. Let's continue living together as before.
Betty sobbed at my words and thanked me, but the anxiety was still there. Even a husband like that was better off around for economic reasons. Now he was gone. I desperately looked for a job, but there was nowhere willing to hire someone who had been a housewife for years. Both my daughter and son said they would work. When I thought it was inevitable, Betty spoke.
Go to college and high school without worrying. You can keep on as before without having to work. Leave it to me.
We tilted our heads at Betty's words, but true to her word, we continued to live unchanged. I think we lived more luxuriously than when my husband was here. I submitted the divorce papers to the court. Betty wanted to file a missing persons report, but I didn't want to see that man again. But surely Betty must want to see her son, my ex-husband. However, even after filing a missing persons report, my ex-husband was never found. Our family of 4 made many memories, and Betty passed away about 2 years ago. In the end, she never got to reunite with my ex-husband while she was alive. After all, he was Betty's son. After all, he is Betty's son. I couldn't just not contact him. But no one lived at the address I found for him. Reluctantly, we had a small funeral and saw Betty off with just the three of us. And now here he is in front of me, my ex-husband. I encountered him by chance when I was out shopping alone. I thought it was a case of mistaken identity and was about to ignore him. But my ex-husband wouldn't take his eyes off me. It wasn't a mistake. Thinking the same, he decided to flaunt the much younger woman beside him and spoke to me.
Lilia, right? You still have that dreary look on your face.
That's rude to say.
The woman beside him chimed in laughing. Their mockery was so blatant that I sighed. And just as I was about to walk past them, he said, "Has the poor old hag kicked the bucket yet?" I stopped in my tracks and glared at my ex-husband.
Poor old hag? Who's that?
I asked, and he snorted with laughter.
You know who. That blind old hag you lived with. I heard the rumors. Must have been tough on you, huh? You're free to go now. Go live your lives. But there's only so much freedom an old hag like you can have.
His vulgar laughter made me reach my boiling point. But getting angry here would be playing right into his hands. I hid my rage and smiled sweetly.
Yeah, I got an inheritance of $3 million, so I'm living freely without work. Thanks for your concern.
Huh?
The smile vanished from the face of my ex-husband, who had just been looking down on me.
Well then, as I started to walk past the stunned ex-husband, he frantically called out to me.
Wait, $3 million inheritance? What are you talking about?
Exactly what it sounds like. Thanks for disappearing. Made the inheritance process smooth without you.
My ex-husband turned pale at my words. I felt it served him right. I wasn't planning on telling him anything, but he should know how shallow a person he is.
Don't joke with me. I'm his son, right? I never heard there was that much inheritance. I have a right to it.
I smiled sweetly at his words.
That's true, but you weren't here. Did you know? It's been 10 years since you disappeared. And legally that's as good as being dead.
Huh?
Therefore, Betty's inheritance was left to me and my daughter and son by her will. You have no part in this anymore.
My ex-husband's foolish face almost made me laugh. I realized after Betty passed away that she had wanted me to file a missing persons report to aim for this. Betty's substantial inheritance. A man claiming to be a lawyer came and explained everything. Betty's family were landowners, but like me, Betty had been estranged from her family, yet she still had the right to inherit. She inherited it when her parents passed away without telling anyone. Thanks to that, we could live without any worries. I once asked Betty,
Betty, what are you doing with your money? If it's your pension, you're free to use it as you like, you know?
to which Betty replied,
I'm using it as I like, to live happily with my family.
Betty had said that. Seeing how she used the money, I knew it wasn't just her pension. But it was definitely Betty's money. We were indeed in need, so we gratefully accepted Betty's generosity. The inheritance Betty had received was more than she could ever spend in her lifetime. The problem that arose at that time was my husband's existence. If things stayed as they were, in the event of something happening to her, my husband would inherit everything. However, Betty did not want him to have it. She was discussing this with a lawyer when my husband went missing. Betty must have thought she had finally cut ties with us. She was sad to leave us, but planned to enter a care facility, thinking that this way she wouldn't bother us, and the inheritance would be mostly used up. But my children and I told Betty that she's family, and let's live as before. Betty couldn't have been happier to leave the inheritance to us. She filed the missing persons report, following the lawyer's advice. Then, by law, as my husband had left home, and a significant amount of time had passed, he was legally considered deceased. 1 year after Betty's death, her children, my daughter and son, inherited in place of my husband. I had no inheritance rights, but Betty left a will, allowing me to inherit too. Thus, we were able to receive Betty's wishes.
You left and Betty paid for Karina and Eddie's tuition and living expenses? Thanks to her, we lived happily. Thank you for leaving.
At my words, my ex-husband just stood there, turning pale. Serves him right. Afterward, my ex-husband made a fuss about still having a legal share and contacted us. I think he's truly terrible for not having contacted us until now.
There's no legal share for someone who's deceased.
I told him that many times, but he wouldn't accept it and wanted to discuss it. We got advice from a lawyer. And for my ex-husband to inherit, there would be complicated procedures. In such cases, it's often the grandchildren who end up inheriting. We had no intention of giving my ex-husband a single dollar. I relayed what the lawyer said to my ex-husband. If he wanted to inherit, he'd have to pay inheritance tax and all that. I told him and he fell silent. The children were present during the discussion too.
I can't take time off work. I can't do procedures like that. An inheritance tax. I shouldn't have to pay that. You guys should pay my share. I deserve it for letting you live off me, right?
I was astounded by my ex-husband's brazenness. Apparently, he's doing day labor now and can't afford to miss even a day. The company my ex-husband worked for, when we were married, ended up firing him due to unexplained absences. When asked why he left the company or why he was in such financial trouble, apparently he had debts to a former mistress. He had been moving from place to place with her, working day jobs to pay it back.
Understand me, he would say, but I couldn't understand him one bit.
So you've broken up with her? Then who was that woman with you the other day?
When I asked, my ex-husband arrogantly said, "She is the one I've been looking for."
My son struggled to hold back his laughter.
Are you married to that woman?
I inquired,
No, it's only been half a year since we met.
but my ex-husband muttered in a low voice. Hearing this, my son couldn't hold back his laughter anymore. My daughter and I, appalled, said nothing, and just sighed at the foolishness of the person in front of us.
What about the woman you left with when we divorced?
She left, saying she couldn't make me happy.
He said it matter-of-factly, but does he not realize he's been dumped? He probably lived his life changing women frequently.
Stop acting young. You're an old man.
I admonished my pitiful ex-husband.
She is the woman of my destiny.
With that, I realized it was pointless to say anything to him. After meeting my ex-husband again, I found out his address. He seems to be living in a woman's condo in the neighboring town. My son bought the entire condo building and became the landlord.
It's money Grandma gave us. It would be a waste just to leave it. I thought it's better to own real estate, my son said.
I thought he wanted to help his dad, but that wasn't the case. If rent was even a day late, he would demand it. The previous landlord had been patient, but my son was not.
My mom had a harder time because of you. You chose this life, so you should struggle more than Mom.
My son said his own way of punishing his dad. My ex-husband never really acted like a father. The children must have had their thoughts on it. Unable to stand such a life, my ex-husband came to our house to apologize and ask for forgiveness.
I'm truly sorry. I was wrong to push parenting and caregiving onto you.
Seeing him like this made me sigh. He was desperate.
But I have my life now. Could you ask Eddie to wait a bit for the rent?
He said with tears in his eyes. He must be struggling.
I don't know. If you had been a good dad to the kids, things would have turned out this way. A bad kid, a bad husband, a bad parent. What's left in your life now? Think about what your life has been, I said.
With that, my ex-husband silently walked away, his figure looking all the smaller. Eventually, due to continued rent arrears, my ex-husband had to leave the condo. His next place seems to be a 50-year-old apartment, where wind enters through the gaps. He seems to still be living day-to-day doing odd jobs. The woman of his destiny who was with him the day we met apparently said goodbye when he had to move out of the condo. Since he couldn't pay the rent, it was inevitable that he would be evicted. He should be grateful that his mistress stayed with him, as long as she did. She was young and probably didn't see him for who he really was, much like I didn't at the time. Thanks to Betty, we are living happily now. As my son said, we invest in real estate and stocks, earning passive income and enjoying many pleasures like traveling every month. And my daughter is going to get married. Her fiancé is very kind and treats me well. Our family and happiness will grow from here. It's because we overcame the difficult past that we have this happy present. I cherish that thought.